People are demanding more from life, and many of the old scripts they inherited are outdated and bring nothing but anxiety and stress. Does this sound familiar? Individuals in the world itself are experiencing a tremendous shift in energy and consciousness, and while unsettling at times, it can be the ride of a lifetime if navigated properly. That's where this show, Mind to Heart, with me, Craig Richardson, carves a pathway from your mind to your heart to activate that innate compass to overcome whatever life sends your way. So won't you join me for this powerful, inspirational, and fun experience, and let the journey begin. Hi, I'm Craig Richardson. Welcome to Mind to Heart. In this show, we take a journey from our logical, critical mind to our heart center, where real transformation can occur. My guests help us understand our journeys by telling us about their paths and lessons they've learned along the way. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Robin Weeks, one of my mentors from Atlantic University. I took 2 courses from Robin in my final 2 semesters. The first was Science and Spirituality, or Science versus Spirituality, which we'll get into today. And the other was about the evolution of human consciousness, which I'm sure will seep in as well. Robin's story is unique in that it took him from a purely scientific background, where he started out in his home country of England, to discovering or rediscovering an innate spirituality. His quest for the truth led him to use his scientifically trained mind to question many of the tenets that modern science presents as infallible. His journey also brought him to the United States, and he now lives in Colorado and Sedona, Arizona. As I do typically with my shows, we'll spend the first half delving into issues, in this case, particularly the dichotomy that now exists between science and spirituality, something that really didn't exist up until a couple hundred years ago. We'll then get into Robin's journey, where he showed how these 2 worlds can be melded back into one, as he went from being a scientist to somebody who's now found and continues to discover his own spirituality. Robin, welcome to Mind to Heart. I know you're a few hours behind me, so I appreciate maybe getting up early, or maybe you're an early bird. I don't know, but welcome.
Thank you. It's good to talk to you again and meet you again.
It's great. It is. We had several of these. Robin was very good at putting videos out, and I always enjoyed. And then we did some Zoom sessions. In our exchange prior to the show, you mentioned and discussed the metaphor of Plato's cave as that being symbolic of your journey. And as I mentioned, in a synchronistic fashion, I was to give a talk at the church I attend a couple weeks ago, and we've had some snowy weather that's rescheduled to a week from this Sunday. And so I think it's, one of the universe's ways of saying, we should discuss this. So what I'd like to do is to begin, if I could, since you are a professor or a teacher, I actually personally didn't know about it, Plato's cave and his metaphor. I guess that's sort of a reflection on some of the schooling I did or didn't get. But I think it'd be important if we could just start out by explaining to people what that metaphor was all about, and then how that relates now to what we've discussed in our course and what's been in your own life.
Okay, so do you want me to describe the allegory of the cave?
Yeah, I think if you just sort of give the Reader's Digest version of what Plato said and what and what that metaphor was all about.
Okay, so it occurs in Plato's Republic, one of the dialogues of Plato, and it's Socrates is sort of giving a teaching on what he thinks true education or true learning is. And so he describes this allegory, and the allegory has slaves, a set of slaves chained deep in a cave, and they're chained facing the back wall. So all they know of life is what they see on the back wall of the cave, and no light gets in from above. Behind the slaves, there's a fire. And of course, the fire casts shadows on the back wall of the cave, even though the slaves can't see the fire. And then there's a walkway between the fire and the slaves where people are walking by carrying different sort of shapes and statues and things. So the slaves see these shadows on the back wall of the cave. And we have to imagine that the slaves are chained there since birth. So all they've known are the shadows on the back wall of the cave. That's all they know. So for them, the world and reality is the shadows on the back wall of the cave. And then Socrates asks us to imagine what it would be like if one of the slaves could turn their head and look back up towards the entrance of the cave and towards the fire and everything. And the idea is that this would be to turn around and look at what reality is, other than the shadows, what's causing the shadows, would be very shocking. And most people would turn back immediately and not want to ever see that again. But occasionally there would be someone who would turn and see this and allow themselves to be sort of transformed by the vision. But it's not just that. He's then asked us to imagine what it would be like if one of these slaves got free of the chains and was able to start walking up out of the cave and then eventually into the sunlight. And at first they would be blinded. They would hate it. Or they would be blinded. It's like, take me back to my chains. But eventually they would get used to the sun and they would recognize that light was the true source of all of the world, the shadow world that they were seeing previously. So obviously it's an allegory. It's supposed to tell us that we tend to see a sort of shallow truth. We live in a world that isn't exactly illusory, but we don't see that there's a deeper and sort of prior truth which illuminates everything that we see in this world. So, and for Plato, this allegory pointed the way towards these universal forms, like the good, the true, and the beautiful. These were divine forms, which were the true source of our world. So he's really talking about a kind of vision of the world that goes beyond our typical five senses. It's sort of seeing into a source of this world that is, if you like, metaphysical rather than physical.
Well, and interestingly, because, one of my favorite movies, trilogies, is The Matrix. And isn't that, in a way, an updated version of Plato's cave? We don't have slaves, thankfully, anymore, and we don't have fires as our primary energy source. But in that movie, it was the same thing. They were in the sim, and it took, and that reality in particular is pretty harsh.
Yes.
It was ultimately a battle in order to get it. That was that, and I think there's some of that in the. And where do you see sort of science's role in are they helping to cast shadows? I mean, I know this is your background primarily coming out of that world, ironically, I think they would suggest that they are the ones helping to discover the world, right?
Yes. Yes, it is ironic. So that there is this idea that through science and then there's the idea of progress, which really came along. We didn't really have an idea of progress that before the scientific revolution, but this idea that we're slowly edging our way towards truth. And so every new scientific theory, every new discovery moves us this little bit closer to truth. And if we use Plato's cave, then if you think about the slaves looking at the world of shadows, you would start to have commentators amongst the slaves on the world of shadows, and they would start to predict what kind of shadow would come next, and they would develop a kind of science of the shadows, which would feel real to them. But it still isn't, right? It's still playing around in the world of shadows. And my perspective, and I don't know if Plato would agree with me, but I've got a feeling he would. But is that's in fact what we're doing in the modern world in the sort of name of exposing truth, in the name of following the science, if you will, in the sense of revealing truth. We actually are still going ever deeper, really, into the world of shadows, and we're not exposing the deeper stratum. So this. Another way to describe this is to describe it as being sort of superficial. So it's breadth, not depth. And we're ever getting broader, ever sort of adding more information and data to this level of information, but we're not through science diving deeper into a kind of reality that science can't even really recognize.
Well, and it wouldn't that depth arguably be the spiritual component? I mean, if we're mind, body, and soul, and we're only looking at a physical being, if you will, if you're a doctor, I mean, and it really strikes me because these studies have been around forever that show, for example, those who have a strong faith and a prayer life while they're going through an illness are a lot more likely to recover faster, stronger, and all the rest. And to me, that's science, right? That's a scientific study. But there seems to be this certain aversion to them even wanting to get into that.
There is, because there are certain assumptions that were made at the sort of beginning of the scientific revolution that I think most scientists don't really know that they've made. And so there's a worldview to be protected that most scientists have. And it's basically materiality is the source of everything, is this worldview. And so it's the same is true with, for example, the theory of evolution. It's like we make the theory of evolution essentially random in the sense of there's random mutations followed by selection, and we have to make it random, because if it wasn't random, then it would be directional, and then that would open this door, a crack, to there being something deeper. There's some kind of purpose or meaning to existence and to what is going on in this world, and that threatens a particular worldview that even though it doesn't actually need to be based on that worldview, that foundation, it is. And so most scientists resist that with great vigor, and will deride people who come in with other suggestions, metaphysical suggestions or spiritual suggestions. So,
well, I think it's what you described in Plato's cave, when the courageous one decides to go out and find out what it is, and he comes running back and says, "Hey, look at what's out there." And they're not like, "Oh, let me go with you." They want to kill him. It's like that you're threatening my worldview, and that can't be, because what happens if I watch on CNN isn't true? I mean, what's going to happen? What else could there possibly be? This is what I've been fed. And I was thinking as you were talking, because as I went through my Atlantic University studies, one of the people that I really kind of fell in love with is Carl Jung. And it struck me as, what would modern psychiatry and psychology be if he were the father of that, as opposed to Sigmund Freud, who, I'm not a huge fan of his, but he did, bring in dreams and stuff. But Jung, whose father, I guess, was a minister, and he had a lot more in spirituality to him. And I find in that field, I'm doing a little life coaching now, to me, that's such an important element when you're dealing with somebody who's going through a journey or going through a crisis or going through an issue, not to be able to bring that element in. I mean, what do you think about if Carl Jung, for example, more of his stuff had do you think we were destined along this path, or can we get out of it?
Yeah, well, Jung was, for me, very important in my getting free of this worldview that I'm talking about of science. So I was working as a scientist and very embroiled in and invested in a particular worldview. But then once I started reading Jung, it started to produce cracks in this worldview, and I was sort of seeing through to something a little deeper. So Carl Jung, I feel like, is very important. And he's important in the sense that he was actually quite scientific in his approach to psychology, and the sort of the unconscious and the collective unconscious were. He wasn't overtly talking about spirituality, but he was, in my felt, opening the door to spirituality. And the point being that, and I'm sort of tuning into what you were saying about working with clients, because most people, many people, and much of our culture is cut off from any kind of source. And so that makes us all prey to a lot of psychological issues and problems. The rise in depression, the rise in suicide, the rise in taking drugs for mental issues and that kind of thing. The whole issue of mental health is sort of like an epidemic in the modern age because we aren't connected to something. And for Jung, this would have been the unconscious and the collective unconscious, where in kind of our vitality, the elan vital, the vital force comes from this life. So if we're cut off from what's truly our source, the source of who we truly are, then we're prey to a lot of neuroses and psychological issues and anxiety and everything that we basically see in our modern world.
Well, one of the things that also exposed me in my my master's with Atlantic University was the whole Joe Dispenza and quantum physics, which we got into with you. And what I've been working on in my own spiritual life is that whole concept of really getting to understand that thoughts are energy and how important thoughts are to your own health. If you walk around like Glum from Gulliver's Travel, we're doomed. We're never going to make it. I mean, what you put out there is what you get back. And can you talk a little bit about that in terms and I don't want to get, because quantum physics, even when, as you explained, it's a little heady stuff, but that to me seems kind of like the back door maybe for science to start looking, because that's been around about 100 years now. And that's talks about what did Einstein call it? Wacky science or something, or?
Yeah. Or play God, he said God does not play dice with the universe. And then he didn't think that, he called quantum theory, or this aspect of quantum theory that is called entanglement, he called spooky action at a distance, which he didn't really believe in those things or didn't want to. So the thing is, so there's a sort of deeper view of science, actually. So science, as we use it today, as it is today, is this kind of edifice that's built on ground that has made certain assumptions, and they're actually metaphysical assumptions. But it doesn't. Science doesn't need to make those assumptions in order to operate. And science, early on, I think, Plato and prior to Pythagoras, science, mathematics, geometry, music was seen as indicative of something deeper, right? If you think about it, in Plato's The Allegory of the Cave, the shadows, when seen rightly, tell you that there must be something creating those shadows, right? So the person who's sort of opened up a bit, may have turned their head or whatever, might start to see that, the shadows are produced by something else. There's something deeper behind these shadows. And yet, so the shadows in themselves are a kind of proof. And this is the same with science, right? So science isn't overtly spiritual, and I don't think it actually can be, but it actually can point, sort of like a finger pointing at the moon. The moon, of course, is not the finger, and the moon being the sort of spiritual source or truth of things. So it's the same way. Science can actually be a finger pointing at the moon. So things like, for me, the better way, the more optimum way to look at things like quantum theory are and really almost any scientific theory ultimately, but it's more obvious with quantum theory, is to see it as a finger pointing at the moon, right? So it's not actually revealing a spiritual truth itself, because it's still in our plane. We're still saying the world's made of equations and mathematics and things like that. We're still saying that it's sort of predictable or probabilistically predictable. So, but it's also very odd. Quantum theory is very odd, and it has these odd aspects to it that sort of makes something a little more obvious, that there's something else going on, that there's this sort of potentially that, it can point the way to this deeper strata. So I think it can be useful for people if to go into spirituality via sort of more rational scientific route. Then that can be something like quantum theory and other aspects of science actually sort of can be useful, but they don't actually reveal a spiritual truth themselves. And that's where we can get a little hung up, I think.
Well, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking of Joseph Campbell and when he describes metaphors, and how important they are. He says they're so important because they allow us with our limited senses to be able to understand some greater mystery. And it seems to me what you're describing when science is maybe in a useful form would be to be, like you said, that finger. It's not it. I think the problem is we get hung up in our rationalistic world that finger itself is the reality. That is what the mystery is. And what you're saying is that if science could be used, at least I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if science could be used more to unveil a greater mystery, to be that metaphor that allows us to say, oh, wow, there is something greater out there.
Yeah. And that is actually my current definition of science. My preferred definition of science is that it is a revealer of mystery. So that what science does is it reveals mystery. And we tend to look at it in our culture as though it's solving mysteries, which on a more shallow level, it kind of is. But of course, those mysteries that it solves, every single scientific law that we have to regard as provisional, because there may be future laws that come down the road that overturn that law. So scientific law is never a final thing, even though we might pretend that it is. But if we sort of just change our angle of view on science a little bit, what it does is reveal this sort of a mystery, right? We're in this sort of probably infinite universe with, countless galaxies and stars and all of the amazing things that have happened that are around us. I mean, I was thinking about the other day, just take a tree outside and go and look at a leaf. Well, do we understand everything about a leaf on a tree? Yeah. No, we don't, right? So it gives every sort of sense that we can keep diving into that leaf deeper and deeper and deeper into its physical sort of truth, and that there's a kind of a bottomlessness to it. So it's like you have to sort of say, well, this, we're not actually getting to an endpoint of a truth endpoint. We can actually just keep going. And that sort of suggests a tremendous sort of mystery, which science can point the way to, but we don't tend to use it that way. We tend to use it as, no, we're going to solve the mystery and one day we'll have solved it all. Well, I don't think that's going to happen.
No, not at all. And I think we're going to take a break here at the bottom of the hour. But speaking of mysteries, we'll get into the Robin Weeks story when we get back, and the mystery that brought you from the old country that I call it, since I'm partly English, to America. So we'll take a break and we'll talk about Robin when we get back. Mind to Heart with me, Craig Richardson, carves a pathway from your mind to your heart to activate that innate compass to overcome whatever life sends your way. As an intuitive life coach, I am ready to guide you to an amazing life. Tune in live every second and fourth Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific on TransformationTalkRadio.com. For more information about me, visit CraigERichardson.com.
Has your kindness been used against you? Are you ready to clear the confusion and reconnect with your power? Then it's time to become toxic person proof. Join toxic relationship specialist Sarah K. Ramsey as she gives you the secrets to rebuilding and rebranding your life after a toxic person encounter. It's time to get past the past, get real about the present, and get serious about your future. For more information, visit sarahkramsey.com.
Hi, I'm Trish Laub from A Cup of Comfort, where we talk about Care Hero topics that nobody wants to talk about. Here's your Care Hero tip of the day. As a child, I took dance lessons. I would twirl through the grocery store, leap from aisle to aisle, and dance anywhere I could. One day, while giving my parents their medications, I realized that dance was my medicine. And when I took my medicine, I was more patient and focused, and my emotional and spiritual tank was filled with more of everything I needed to be a better caregiver and daughter to my parents. I realized that self-care was not selfish, but rather self-love, and that it was essential to my ability to be resilient and to recharge and thrive instead of merely survive. So now when I need to recharge, I turn up the volume and dance it off. What's your medicine? Tune into my show to learn more. See you the second and fourth Tuesday at 12 Pacific, 3 Eastern, here on Transformation Talk Radio. Feel free to reach out to me at info@trishlaub.com.
Heaven on Earth, your online school of divinity, building your inner coach as you lay down your foundation in the new earth with you as the authority. Take action now. The number one challenge people face every day is the negative voice in their head. We work each day to turn negatives into positives. It's all a matter of perception. Our challenge at this time is to remain intensely positive and focused, creating the world we wish to live in. Wake up on purpose with Cornelia's daily online positive messages guiding us in the new paradigm. Raise yourself into happiness and inner peace daily. Elevate your personal frequency, free from negativity, and reprogram yourself step by step, shifting your energy patterns with positive repetition, daily building your new earth with someone you trust. All the heavy lifting has been done for you. Wake up happy with CorneliaStephanieVIP.com. Try free for 7 days now.
Hi, welcome back to Mind to Heart with Craig Richardson and my guest, Robin Weeks. If you want to get more information about me, my website is craigericardson.com. And I think under Robin's name here, we'll have his YouTube URL, so you can check out his and get a hold of him as well. Robin, before the break, we got into, at least touched the surface on this sort of science versus, or science and spirituality, to be kinder. And again, when you and I were talking about this show itself, you thought, one of the things I thought would be great to have you on there is that you really epitomized both of those, because I think, as you mentioned, they weren't separated forever. So can we start in England and get some background on your upbringing and where you grew up and your life story?
Yeah, we can do that to some extent. I was brought up. I don't know if many of your listeners will have traveled in Europe or may have lived in Europe, but it's, especially in Britain, it's like we're not quite as religious as people are in America. And so there's a lot of skeptics in Europe and England. But I was brought up in a secular household, so we weren't religious, and really value was placed on science mostly. My father was an architect, but my mother a teacher, but we didn't have any spirituality in my upbringing. We was sort of exposed to it at school because they're allowed to have religion in school in Britain. So we began the day with a religious, mostly Christian service every day. So I was familiar with it, but I didn't really have any investment or experience with spirituality. And in fact, the opposite, my investment was in ever more towards science. So when I discovered that I had this love of nature, right? And as a kid, I was always playing out in nature and exploring and streams and everything, and then getting out on the ocean and in the water. And I thought that my best way to get closer to this thing that I loved was going to be through science. I thought, I'm going to know more about this. So there's this sense of, if you know more about something, then you know it. You see what I mean? Then you know it better. And so all you have to do is accumulate more sort of facts and information about something to know it better. Now, I, of course, question that approach, but so I went into science because it related to something that I loved, which was nature. And I thought that it was my way to get to know nature. And so, I went to college in Britain and studied geophysics. Geophysics, why? Because it's physics used to study the earth, right? Which contained everything that I seemed to love in terms of nature. So I did geophysics there, and then came over to America. This is the beginning of my downfall.
Well, wouldn't be the first time that somebody from England came over and didn't have a good experience, shall we say?
Well, it was a good experience, and I'm still here. So
well, we're happy you are.
So, and I went to did a Ph.D. in California, also in geophysics, studying the Earth's magnetic field and how it works, and I was just getting deeper and deeper. So how I just sort of like to describe this is my journey into Plato's cave, right? So this was the journey in to become a believing slave at the bottom of the cave. And so I became, and in this period, in the period of my 20s, I was what I describe as a fundamentalist scientist. Science was all I believed in. Anyone else was kind of stupid, actually, to believe in anything else. So religion to me was silly. And
well,
science
as you indicate, because, we are a much more religious culture. I mean,
yes.
and plus we're Americans, right? So we wear our emotions on our sleeve, which is probably two things that you probably weren't used to. And so I can see that would have been a little bit like, whoa. But, in California around geophysics, you probably found some like-minded folks. I mean, they're pretty smart out there.
Well, most of my colleagues in science. So my experience in science, and I ended up, in total, probably spending 30 years in science. So I got deep into science professionally. And there was never any discussion amongst my scientific colleagues about religion or spirituality. It was kind of a no-no. You don't go there, so don't talk about this. And so we all sort of there was an assumption that we all had a particular attitude about religion and this kind of thing, spirituality, that it wasn't really real or sensible. In fact, after my PhD, I again ended up getting a job at the University of Washington in Earth and Space Sciences, and I did actually by accident run into scientists that had a sort of spiritual, maybe have had a spiritual experience or something that had opened them up, and we formed this little group called the Science and Spirituality Group, which we met in secret. So we met in people's houses with the curtains closed. It's like we don't want anyone to know that this is what we're doing.
Well, I was going to ask you, Jimmy, what would happen, say, for example, if somebody, tragically lost a child or got cancer? I mean, was there just no response, or like, oh, it's a tough one, buddy, hope you're doing okay? Or
that's right. It's just there was this sort of sense of science that it was like you tough it out, right? Because what we're doing here is, instead of like believing in superstition and religion and that kind of thing to comfort us, we have now come of age as a sort of humanity, and we can sort of face the truth that this is just atoms and subatomic particles rearranging themselves all around us. There's no real meaning or purpose to anything, and you go through life and then you die, and so it's like, let's face up to this sort of cold world, this cold universe, and so there's this sense of that's what we're doing. That's our humanity's coming of age. So there's a kind of peer pressure in science to hold on to this attitude, to not sort of crack and then open yourself to something that is mere superstition and mere myth, and not and thereby delude ourselves. We want to be in this world with our eyes open to this cold, infinite universe that we're in.
Or a cave wall.
Or the cave wall, which of course it's you when you're in that position as a scientist, you don't think it's the cave wall, you think it's reality, and so you think anyone who professes anything different has got to be kind of crazy, possibly. And then the other important thing, though, is that there are plenty of scientists that have religious beliefs. It turns out, if statistically, I didn't meet them, but not or at least not many. But scientists of that kind are able to keep their religious beliefs, if they're Christian beliefs, separate from their sort of day job. So they're able to sort of keep these two things separate. And I think the one thing that science did was it kind of drove God out of this world. So it's like you're walking out in nature, and the world out there is what we study. And then God is somehow beyond this world, And so it sort of furthered this sort of split between God and the sort of everyday world that we live in.
I was going to say, that's really kind of what the program has been, hasn't it? Since, well, like we went in our course, it's got late 1800s. It obviously has its roots in the Enlightenment, but that's kind of the way we set it up, right? Even in the professional world, you go to work Monday through Friday and hang out on Saturday, and you worship on Sunday, and then you start it over again. And we've sort of put God on a shelf for most of the time. It's interesting. I'm reading if you've ever read or I'm actually the audiobook, the Shack, the book, The Shack, or it's very powerful. But it talks about sort of developing a personal relationship with God, which is really, even amongst the religion, the formalized religion, it's difficult to because in the end, and if the Christian belief is obviously Jesus himself was the personification of God become man, but all religions talk about a personal relationship, and to me that seems a very difficult in general because of our culture. But I can imagine for you in science that you just, like you said, it was God was something out there, and for even those that were of faith.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's something out there, and it's something you don't talk about in science. You don't bring it into science. We still, it's really odd because we're still able somehow to look at the world through this material lens. So everything is materiality around us. And this split happened, about 400 years ago that we epitomized the split by looking at Descartes and his philosophy. But it's so scientists get this world, they own this world and all of its materiality, but then who we are, us, was something that was left to the church. So our inner life or everything was then left to the church. So there was this sort of split. But the problem is, what happened was, and I know we're talking theoretically and not about my life, but what happened was that this inner life that for Descartes was regarded as something different than the material world. This, you might call it consciousness, or whatever that we appear to have. In the modern world, science has increasingly decided that it can explain that too. So it's whatever, Descartes had this area left for God in a relation with God, but science has slowly taken that away, and through sort of neuroscience and everything, we now think that who we are rises out of our brains. So
it's not connected. We're not connected. We're going to go ahead and skip our break here because I want to get, continue with your story. It's very fascinating. So you got to the point where you were meeting in secret, with your secret handshakes, so that nobody was from the scientific. Can you just? That's a fascinating image. But can you explain to me? Something must have happened. I mean, did one of these acorns fall on your head or something? What sort of made you go from Robin? Sort of, this is all there is to, there might be something more. Was there a moment? Was there a song? Was there something that happened?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, first of all, I think it was kind of a really slow process, like reading Carl Jung, like in my early 30s, for example. There was things that were sort of forming these little cracks in my worldview. And then I actually did I had Christian friends, but strangely enough, that I really loved these Christian friends, and I could see that Christianity had really done something for these people, and so I was starting to get curious, I would say, and curiosity is a dangerous thing. So scientists are supposed to have it, right? But what you find with the majority is that there are these limits, so that their curiosity might sort of take place within these limits, but they don't let the curiosity take them beyond these limits. And I'm just not that kind of person. So my curiosity started to, and this kind of curiosity is what I think it's very scientific. There could be such a thing as what I would call a true scientist that simply goes where their curiosity takes them. And
goes where the data takes them.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. They don't pose limits. So that's what was happening to me. But and then it all sort of cracked or something. And I for various reasons, I suppose you can never really say what actually caused these things. I started to have spiritual experiences, and I had experiences that actually blew me out of the water. I couldn't even believe it. It's like you think the slave at the bottom of the cave is looking at the world of shadows, not knowing that that's just a world of shadows. When the slaves actually catches a glimpse of the light, then what is happening is that a deeper reality, in fact, more of reality, is suddenly perceived by that slave. And when you have a spiritual experience, this is the intrusion of a sort of true reality into one's life. And you don't forget it and you don't ignore it. So
reminds me a little of the people, and not that this was your experience, but the near-death experiences where they can be as atheistic as they, but then when they have that, they're never the same. They're touched. They're literally touched by the finger of God, and they go back. In fact, ironically, they don't want to come back. They're like, and I think that's what you described with the daring to turn around in the cave and in that reality. And even in the Matrix, like I said, it wasn't that great a reality that those guys were eating gruel or whatever it was, and they were in fights with the machines. But the fact that they were free and that they knew a greater reality than what they had been living was enough to keep them going. And it sounds like you had whatever that spiritual awakening was for you that really changed your life.
That's right. And then it's like a whole new world opened up for me at that time. And at the time I thought of it as sort of an inner world. So and through meditation and practices like that, I wanted to explore that world, this inner world. And through science, I had been exploring outwardly. But my curiosity, once you sort of see a whole universe opening up, well, you want to explore it if you've got true scientific curiosity. So I did. I started to explore that, and I got into meditation and formed these groups, and slowly it became clear that I was messing around with the shadows for me when I was doing science. And I kind of ran from science. Actually, I just felt like because I'd experienced existence beyond the mind, so I had experienced periods where my mind had gone completely quiet, and yet I was more alive than ever I had ever been. And so I started to know that I wasn't my mind. I identified myself with my mind in the past, but now I know that there's more than the mind. So I sort of was on the run from the mind. I sort of, for a little while, just a few years, I kind of made mind the enemy. Mm-hmm. And then I was just into spiritual practice and meditation practice and meditation retreats. And, and I left science and I went to Naropa and did a master's degree in religious studies.
Oh, wow.
And so Naropa is a place that, was started by a Tibetan Buddhist, and they believed in what they call the model of education was called contemplative education. So you had to do contemplative practice as well as academic study, and going backwards and forwards between your insides and your outsides. And for me, ultimately, that became quite transformative. But the odd thing about it was that I got there thinking that I was leaving science and the mind behind. And what happened was science and the mind came back in a wholly different way for me. I didn't let it go. I didn't ditch it entirely. In fact, I discovered that I had a deep love for science and the use of the mind. It's just that it wasn't the whole story. And so there's the sort of subject of your show, your podcast is this journey from the mind to the heart. And that's this thing. The heart is, for me, sort of the gateway to this sort of spiritual perception, the perception of the light that's coming down Plato's cave, not the shadows. And so it needs to be in charge of this process. But nevertheless, the mind is still this brilliant thing that we've got. I mean, the world of ideas and what we've done with our minds, what we can do with our minds is fantastic. It's brilliant. And all of the history of all the world's thought and thinking is amazing. So, well,
as you're talking, I'm thinking of that child when you were out in the creek in England, and it seems to me you kind of rediscovered that in a way. I mean, because you when you're kids, you're sort of naturally spiritual. You don't really know it, but you hadn't been drummed into that. You hadn't been in that scientific culture or world culture really. But it sounds to me like as you're talking, you've kind of reconnected with that child again, where you're just enjoying, because you're right, it is, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, is one of your expressions you used to use a lot. You don't want to say, oh, the mind is nothing, I'm just going to, and it's very natural, I think, when you discover spirituality or anything, sort of throw yourself into it and say, oh, everything else I did before was wrong and now it's right. And so I think your story beautifully illustrates how it's a coming back together of these two, the mind and the heart.
That's right. And that's, the original meaning of, well, we have the word yoga, of course, which we all probably know means union. So it's the union of two things. But religion also in its origins, as you go back into the Latin, religio and religare, it also meant binding together. So something's sort of coming into this world, however we do that, something tends to get sort of split apart or separated. And so there's a process of rebinding things together that is needed. And that happens through spirituality and religion. And I'm no longer anti-religious, obviously, because I clearly see that there's something important that religion has to do for us. Otherwise, we live in this world as a partial being. In fact, not even really aware of our being. And that's not a good place to be.
Well, I remember discussing in your class, so we and you presented some information where 100 years ago, or more than that, 110 years ago or 20 years ago, science basically said we've solved the God problem, there is no God. And it's that T-shirt that I've been reminded of, where the front says God is dead, Nietzsche, and on the back it says Nietzsche is dead, God. So he got beat up pretty badly in the 20th century, but I think as we get towards, or whatever your concept of universal consciousness or all, I just see that, the positive is, and again, I think your story illustrates that, because not only was it your own story, but it was also the time frame when you were living, and I most of that time with I mean, the culture itself had become very, atheistic in a way, and now we're getting to a point where these spiritualities, you had your experience in Naropa, and we've got yoga, you mentioned, and it seems that we are coming back together again, are we not?
I hope you're right. It's now probably 10, 15 years since I was actually working as a scientist, and back then I didn't sort of see a new way, a new worldview sort of penetrating into the realms, the halls of science that I was walking around in. But it may be that we're in the midst of a shift, and that's happening more and more. Certainly I know of scientists that are, have spirituality and are exploring the limits of science. So, I mean, I hope you're right, because it certainly seems to me to be what's needed for our culture.
Well, and I think the field you just discussed and the one that you were part of is going to be the last nut to crack, is it not? I mean, maybe not. I mean, maybe some will take, because I think, like you said, when you apply the scientific process to the universe and bring in things that you weren't willing before, I think you're ultimately led to the conclusion. But I mean, maybe not. Maybe that is going to be a tough nut to crack.
I don't know. I take sort of people like Stephen Hawking, for example. I mean, they've got an incredibly deep understanding of theoretical physics, theoretical probably and experimental physics, but remained an atheist. And that this wasn't, of course, true of Einstein and many other scientists. Most of the founders of quantum theory were at the same time mystics. So there are definitely precedents for having a deep spirituality. For I think for Einstein, there was a kind of, for me, one of the main things about science and our time in nature, or basically opening to life, is the experience of wonder, or in the sense of awe and wonder. And when this is awe and wonder is like this little doorway open to the light coming down Plato's cave, right? So for someone like Einstein, you can see it when you read what he said and things that he said, that the universe for him was a kind of doorway to this sort of deeper sense of wonder and awe, which is the beginning. Plato said that philosophy begins in wonder, philosophy being the love of wisdom, begins in wonder. Well, and spirituality may well begin in wonder.
Well, I think we have about a minute or so left, but I think that, you mentioned the door, and you've mentioned cracks throughout the way, and I do think that that's been what's happening, is that the God's love or the infinite intelligence love is starting to penetrate. It's not everybody, and that's partly why we're here, I think, just to learn. But in the last couple of seconds here or so, do you have any parting wisdom that you want to instill on my listeners? And I really appreciate you taking the time.
I don't know about parting wisdom, but it's I think for me the whole process is to become aware of our worldview and be able to try and step out of our worldview in that process of transformation. So it's realizing that we have a limited perspective that at least in part creates our reality, the reality that we see. So, and reality is always greater than what we can see.
Well, that's well put. And I think, it's simple. I think it is. It's as simple as going outside as Robin did as a child and now as an adult and enjoying nature. So again, Robin, it was a pleasure to spend time with you. I miss our time together at Atlantic University, and hopefully you'll come back sometime. Thanks.
I would love to. Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Mind to Heart with me, Craig Richardson. My path has led me from the Protestant and Catholic churches, as well as studies in alchemy, mediumship, Eastern philosophy, and most recently, Edgar Cayce and transpersonal psychology. As an intuitive life coach, I am ready to guide you to an amazing life. For more information about me, visit craigericardson.com.
Views expressed on this program are those of the host, guests, and callers, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the station, its management, or advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.